today we're going to cover a couple of things. We're going to cover how to query for different screens and different devices, as well as different screen resolutions, different aspect ratios. And we're also going to talk about, how do we change up content on the page or reflow the page based on those parameters. So that all is done in CSS, and there are, of course, ways to do, responsive web design in things that are.
There we go.
Sorry. I could tell I was being signaled for something, but wasn't quite sure what. Now I know. Yeah.
Thank you, Barry.
But yeah, so what was I saying? Oh, yeah, there are other ways to do responsive web design. The meta viewport tag, for example, is something that is used quite commonly, but we're going to cover just media queries in CSS.
Okay.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to query for basically different screens and different devices. And when we do that, I want to first cover what are some good media queries? What are some good examples of media queries? Why do we need them? So I have two examples that I wanted to show you guys. The first is a list apart. This is actually a pretty great website if you're just in general interested in web design and want to read some great literature on that. So this is basically an online web magazine on web design. And you can see right now that our screens are pretty big. Maybe you can't see that, but you can actually see a lot of content on this page, and you see that the text is and the text is quite large. But they do account for when you're scaling down the page. So you can see my window is maximized now as I am making that page smaller. You see that the image up top, this header image, is gradually changing in size as well. And it's a subtler change, but the text size is actually also going to change right when we hit this break. And you'll see that this issue number, which is very cute, but not exactly necessary on the page, also disappears alongside this ad.
Nice.
Yeah.
And it automatically shows up down below. That little the issue number 409 then slides down there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the page content is reflowed quite nicely. Everything is a bit smaller, and yeah, I know that a lot of this, such as this text down here, as well as this text up here, looks like it's being cut off. That's actually just their stylistic choice. You'll see even when we're maximized, it's potentially hidden a little bit behind the bar.
Okay.
Nice design choice. So yeah, so that's one instance of what a media query could look like. The Square website, that very famous payment processor, is also incredibly beautiful, and they do really great responsive design with media queries. So you see this is just the full page right now, and I want you guys to pay attention to a couple of things when we're resizing. One is a couple of these things are first this contact support and log in up here, as well as actually this banner for World AIDS Day. So you'll see when I make this page smaller, things are reflowing as you might expect. But when we hit this break right here, actually these icons change to be much smaller, perhaps better touch targets if you're on a mobile device.
Yep.
And some, I guess you would say, more extraneous text is also being reflowed down here. And you'll also see when we scroll down the page that a lot of these items are now aligned in one column, whereas before they had multiple rows depending on the size up here. And these are actually similar to or perhaps same as the inline blocks that we're using before. These elements are great because they do reflow for you, so you don't need to do anything special for that. You can of course choose to size them down, size the text down, things like that, but I mean in terms of the blocks flowing down the page, they'll do that on their own, which is great.
That's cool.
Yeah, so these are, I thought, two really great examples of what really awesome media queries could look like, and ideas for what you might be able to do or want to do with a media query. But let's actually get on to how to create a query. So a query is composed of a couple of things. The first is the media type. The second are media features, and then there are also logical operators. So I know this sounds very vague. I'm going to go into examples of each one. Don't worry. I just want you to have an expectation of all the different things that are involved in a media query. So the first thing are the media types. So there are a lot out there. There are the standards that we expect, like all, meaning all screens, to print, meaning what we talked about before, page that is for printing, to screen, which is a computer screen, and speech, which is a speech reader. And these are the ones that are the most commonly used. But in addition to that, there are a bunch of other things. There's Braille, embossed, which is for an embossed Braille printer, basically. There's also handheld for handheld devices, projection for, that's actually, projection,
yep.
TVs, and then also TTY, which I never remember what it stands for, but it is the oral helper for those who are hard of hearing.
Right.
So I bolded the ones up here, the print, the screen, and the speech, because those are the ones that people most commonly work with, and probably the ones that are most relevant, and the ones that are most supported by different browsers.
Right. Yeah. The one that's on that list that I always like to highlight, because people will gravitate towards it immediately when they first see it, is that handheld, because they immediately think, oh, okay, that must be what I want. The problem with handheld is that it doesn't give you a whole lot of information, that it really is designed for the older style phones, and you really don't want to use it, because just because a device is handheld doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a rich device. So we want to focus in on doing those media queries rather than going for handheld.
Yeah, and so you can, instead of just querying purely for type, there are also a lot of properties that you can query for, which end up being much more helpful in determining whether or not a device is, for instance, like a touch-enabled handheld device.
Yeah.
So some of the media features that I wanted to highlight were these ones. So again, the top, the bolded ones are the ones that you'll most likely be using more of. It's the width and the height of the page. Now, you're not querying for just one specific width or one specific height. You're typically doing a min width, a max width, a min height, or a max height.
Right.
Or you could alternatively use device width and device height, which the difference between the two is the width and the height is basically the width and height of the browser, which may or may not be actually the width of the device or the height of the device, right? Because, for instance, I could I could scale down a browser window, and I'd have a very small width and height for that browser window, but my device width and device height are still going to be large,
right?
The size of my entire screen. And you can query for things like that to know exactly what you're looking for. There's also orientation. So whether the device is landscape or whether it's in portrait view, because you might want to reflow content or maybe even like turn content depending.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen one of my favorite little examples of the orientation is that if you're in portrait mode, if you're looking at a table of content, then what'll wind up happening is you'll get maybe 2 columns, and then you flip that to landscape, and then we'll automatically add in a third or fourth, kind of a little bit more detail there. So kind of a neat little thing that you can do. And again, with CSS, no JavaScript involved. The moment that the browser detects that change, it'll apply that query and automatically show those columns or hide those columns respectively.
Yeah, and I really like doing things with CSS on mobile because a lot of mobile browsers aren't nearly feature compatible with the desktop equivalents.
Absolutely.
So these are just much more straightforward and much more reliable.
Yeah, one of my biggest peeves is opening up a site on a mobile device, and it takes 15 seconds for it to load up, or what'll happen is maybe if it's like a news article, you scroll down and then all of a sudden some last little bit of JavaScript fires, and then it goes back up to the top again. Yeah, the less processing that you can do, the easier things are going to be. The more that you focus in on CSS, the faster that's going to take place typically on a mobile browser.
Yeah, and there are other things that you can query for as well, feature-wise, on a device. You can query to see if it's a color device or a monochrome device. Though I really haven't seen that many monochrome devices, to be honest. You could look for resolution and et cetera, et cetera. But as I said, the top 4 are probably the ones that you're going to be most interested in. And next, I wanted to talk about some logical operators that we can use to sort of structure these queries. Because you're not going to be looking for necessarily just one thing. Mm-hmm. You're not looking for all screens or even all things of this minimum height. You might want something that's between 2 things. So one good example of this is if you have a large screen, or if you have your site, you want it to look one way for a large, perhaps desktop mode. You want something that's slightly smaller, maybe something that's like tablet size or just like half width of a browser. And you also want something that's even smaller than that, something like a phone. And it's nice when you're in that middle spot to say, I want the max height to be this, and if the max height is this and the min height is this, so if the height is between these two variables, I want to display this set of CSS properties. So a lot of these are very good. And I wanted to kind of drive this point home, let's look at some example queries. So the first one we have media, min width 500 pixels. This basically just says if the page or the browser is this should be. Yeah, so if the page width is greater than 500 pixels, so 500 being the minimum, it should display these things. I didn't really put any properties in here. This is just, those are the parameters.
The important part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is just how to query, and then we'll talk later on about what are some of the considerations you should put inside of that. The next is what I just talked about, when you set a min width and a max width. So basically, if the page width is now between 700 pixels and 960 pixels, what should you do? And I guess this is a good point to say. I mostly use min width because that is overwhelmingly the best indicator of sort of someone's screen size. Because to tell you the truth, even sort of device width is sometimes finicky and not always supported. It's not always reported accurately. It's not always reported. But min width, it's the width of the browser. It's pretty, not foolproof, but it's close.
Yeah.
And if someone is resizing your page, there's still a reason for that, and you want to refill content appropriately. So that's why the min width is there. And you'll notice that I don't have sort of a media type on there. And so if you don't have a media type on there, that just applies to sort of all media types. Whereas in this third example, I have media screen and not device aspect ratio 4/3. So that says as long as this device is a screen, so self-explanatory. If it is basically a screen and the device aspect ratio is not 4:3, so if it's not sort of the old school monitor size, then apply these properties.
Right.
Whereas the bottom one is media screen and device aspect ratio 16:9 and 16:10. That's so these would just query for these two aspect ratios, and it would apply only if the aspect ratio is 16:9 or 16:10, so widescreen devices,
right.
For instance. And so, these are just some of the common queries you might consider using. I think the device aspect ratio ones are not as useful as sort of the page width ones, and in fact those are the ones that we're going to be working with, and we're actually going to add all these into the page that we created in module 3. So we're going to make our module 3 page a bit more responsive. It'll resize, the elements will resize based on your page width.
Perfect.
So one last thing is CSS importing before we get to that example. CSS importing goes hand in hand with media queries because the only parameter that you can really put in to import other CSS files are essentially media query files. So when I say import CSS, I mean within your CSS file, you can basically call out to another CSS file and include all of those components inside. It's really important to put these in the beginning of your CSS file. That's the only place that they can go. So they have to precede all other elements. And you can import them in a couple ways. You can import them using the URL sort of function tag, or you can just do the straight string for their location. And these would just be unconditional imports because there are no parameters that we specified. Whereas for the two subsequent examples, you'll see I'm importing a basic.css for basically a print media type. And so that just uses the basic CSS only if this page is, or only if the print media query is triggered. Whereas this following one, it's importing the large screen CSS files for TV or projection media types. So if it's something like a large screen, perhaps you want to change up the CSS to make fonts larger, images larger, increase contrast perhaps. That's when you'd use something like that. So I think imports are a nice way to sort of separate out your media queries from the rest of your CSS for what your standard page should be.
Because CSS can get pretty big as it is. The moment you then start putting in, you start targeting specific device sizes, then it can just get out of control. So it's a nice way to break it down, make it more manageable.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.